Hey there, friend. Richie G's on the move again, taking steps to clear the mind in a place where you never walk alone. Yeah, it's an open space filled with grace where everybody gets to know Jesus' name.
So imagine a woman, right? She is standing on a brightly lit stage.
Okay.
She's speaking to this massive arena of, I don't know, maybe 5,000 people. And she is commanding, she's authoritative, and she is just unpacking this deep, complex theology.
Setting the scene. I like it.
Yeah, and in a really large portion of the Christian tradition, she is celebrated as a visionary leader for this.
Yeah.
Her event is sanctioned, it's sponsored, people are applauding.
Right.
But, and here is the twist, if just 10 men walk into that exact same arena and just sit quietly in the back row, in that same tradition, she is suddenly breaking a 2,000-year-old boundary.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. The entire dynamic flips. And
Yeah.
the question is just, why?
Yeah, and that invisible line, that threshold where celebration suddenly turns into a structural theological crisis.
Right.
It is arguably one of the most fiercely debated frontiers in modern religious life right now.
Yeah.
Because it forces us to ask what actually constitutes authority. I mean, is it the words being spoken?
Or the person speaking them.
Exactly. The person, or maybe the physical room, or even just the specific ears receiving the message.
Well, today we are taking a deep dive into the theology, the history, and the really practical application of women teaching in the church. And this is all grounded in the ancient letters of the Apostle Paul.
It's a huge topic.
It is massive.
Right.
And before we go any further, I want to be incredibly clear with you, the listener, about our baseline today. We are exploring the complementarian and evangelical viewpoints that we found in our research.
Right, which we need to define for people.
Yes, exactly. We are stepping into this framework totally neutrally. We aren't here to endorse it. We're not here to dismantle it. Our mission is just to deeply understand the reasoning and the historical mechanics that drive it.
Yeah, and for those who, might not spend their weekends reading theology textbooks.
Which is probably most people.
Fair. Complementarianism is basically the theological framework that men and women are entirely equal in fundamental worth and dignity, but they're designed with distinct complementary roles.
Okay, distinct roles.
Right, particularly when it comes to the structural leadership of the family and the church.
Got it. And I think whether you are inside these traditions or just looking at them from the outside, the way these communities try to balance ancient texts with modern reality, it's honestly a masterclass in organizational structure and human dynamics.
It really is.
And the thing that hooked me immediately is that the debate rarely hinges on the simple yes or no that we usually assume. Instead, the focus is surprisingly practical. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
The research suggests that before you even look at the gender of the speaker, you actually have to measure the square footage of the room.
I know, it sounds absurdly pragmatic, right?
It really does. Like, get out the tape measure for theology.
Exactly. But the physical scale of the gathering is actually a primary defining factor in the biblical blueprints these churches use. Like, when you survey the New Testament, you find a highly specific pattern. Yeah. When women are depicted actively teaching scriptural truth and correcting theology, it is almost exclusively situated in small, private, or relational settings.
I see.
Yeah, it's noticeably absent from the large public institutional assemblies.
Right, and I found the classic example of this in the story of Priscilla and Aquila.
Oh, yes. Great example.
So you have this husband and wife team in the first century, and they cross paths with a man named Apollos. And Apollos is this incredibly eloquent, passionate speaker, but his theology has some pretty significant blind spots.
Yeah, he's missing crucial pieces of the puzzle.
Exactly. But the text doesn't have Priscilla standing up in the middle of the synagogue to publicly debate him or, deliver a corrective sermon.
Right.
Instead, she and her husband pull him aside privately into their home, and they explain the way of God to him more accurately there.
Which is a profound interaction. I mean, Priscilla is exercising immense theological clarity and influence over a man who is a prominent public teacher. But the boundary line drawn by complementarian theologians is that her instruction occurs within the context of the oikos, the household.
The household. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the Greco-Roman world and in the theology derived from it, the household is a space of deep relational influence. Whereas the public assembly, like the synagogue or the church gathering, that carries a completely different kind of ordained institutional weight.
So the research refers to this scale distinction as a softer landing spot for people wrestling with the modern application. The idea is that, relational teaching is celebrated, but the public pulpit is restricted.
Yes, exactly.
But does that distinction actually hold up to scrutiny? Because it feels a bit like the corporate world, where mentoring someone one-on-one over coffee is treated entirely differently than delivering the keynote address at a shareholders meeting.
That's a really good comparison.
Right. But I want to push back a little here. Is it really just about headcount, or does a larger audience inherently change the nature of the authority being exercised? I mean, a mentor at a coffee shop can fundamentally alter your life and your beliefs.
Oh, absolutely.
That is an enormous amount of authority. Does moving that exact same conversation to a stage with a microphone really change things that much?
Well, what's fascinating here is how institutional structures universally define authority versus influence.
Okay, authority versus influence.
Yeah. Think about the judicial system. A brilliant legal scholar can give you incredibly persuasive advice over dinner.
Sure.
That is profound influence. But a judge sitting on the bench possesses a localized, ordained authority to make a binding ruling for the community.
Oh, I see the difference.
Right. So the complementarian framework views the pulpit not just as a platform for sharing information, but as the bench of the local church. The private conversation embraces relational influence, but the public gathering represents the structural order of the community.
Which brings us crashing right back into my opening scenario.
Yep, the arena.
Right. If the principle is that public platforms carry an institutional weight that living rooms don't, how does that square with the reality of modern mega conferences?
Oh, the scale completely shatters the small room dynamic.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because you can have a woman teaching a crowd of 10,000 people on a massive stage, full production value, lighting, the works. And that is universally celebrated in these traditions.
Provided every single person in the audience is female.
Exactly. It totally breaks the small room rule.
It does shatter the scale.
Yeah.
And it introduces the second, far more contentious variable, which is the gender makeup of the audience.
Right.
The historical application here leans really heavily on instructions like Titus chapter 2.
Okay, what does Titus 2 say?
It explicitly directs older women to teach younger women. So modern churches take that instruction and they just scale it up to the size of the stadium. The logic is that as long as the audience is female, the boundary of institutional male authority over the whole congregation is not being crossed.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. I want to push on the friction of that logic.
Go for it.
You have a gifted woman. Her theology is flawless. She is a master communicator. She just spiritually edified 5,000 women. If 10 men walk into the back of that room, the content of her speech hasn't changed. Her competency hasn't diminished at all.
Not one bit.
But suddenly, the dynamic of her teaching is viewed as a violation. If a gifted woman is trusted to teach thousands of women with great impact, why does adding men to the room suddenly change the dynamic of her teaching? What exactly is shifting there?
So to understand that shift, you have to look at the three foundational criteria that this tradition demands of literally any teaching scenario.
Okay, what are they?
Whenever someone holds the microphone, the teaching must be scripturally sound, it must be done in an orderly way, and it must edify or basically build up the church.
Sound orderly and edifying. I mean, that seems universally applicable.
It is, but the hinge point is how they define orderly. In the complementarian worldview, order isn't just about, keeping the noise down so people can hear the speaker.
Right, like raising your hand to speak.
Yeah, no, order implies a divine hierarchy. It involves adhering to Paul's specific instructions regarding male leadership in the public, mixed assembly. So when men enter the room, the gathering transitions from a localized demographic, a women's ministry, into a representation of the gathered universal church.
Wow, just by adding a few men.
Yep. And for these traditions, the structural order God ordained for the gathered church requires male headship. So the objection isn't about the woman's competency at all. It's an objection regarding the structural order.
That is fascinating. But that structural order relies entirely on letters written 2,000 years ago.
It does.
And the research makes a very aggressive point here, which is that you cannot just lift a sentence from a first-century letter and paste it into a 21st century boardroom or sanctuary without knowing the context.
Absolutely not.
The sources really emphasize that Paul's strictest instructions, the ones that sound like absolute blanket silencing of women, were actually highly localized corrective measures. He was putting out specific fires in specific cities.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, removing the historical context turns a surgical intervention into a blunt instrument. Paul wasn't writing theology textbooks into a vacuum. He was writing urgent letters to communities that were in absolute crisis.
Let's talk about the crisis in Ephesus, because I feel like that historical backdrop changes everything. Paul writes his most restrictive instructions to Timothy, who is pastoring the church in Ephesus. And Ephesus wasn't just a random city.
No.
It was the global epicenter of the cult of Artemis.
Exactly. The Temple of Artemis was one of the wonders of the ancient world. It was a massive economic and cultural engine for the city. And importantly, it was a female-dominated religious cult.
Right.
The priestesses held immense hegemonic authority there. So the entire societal assumption in Ephesus was that female spiritual leadership was supreme, authoritative, and honestly often domineering over men.
So you have this brand new Christian church trying to survive in Ephesus. People are converting from the Artemis cult, they're walking into the Christian gathering, and they are bringing all that cultural baggage with them.
Naturally, yeah.
And the research indicates you had women trying to forcefully usurp authority, asserting spiritual dominance in a way that was, culturally familiar to them, but entirely contrary to the Christian gospel.
And that localized chaos requires a localized authoritative boundary.
Right.
When Paul writes, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man," he is using specific Greek terminology that implies a forceful, domineering usurpation of authority. He's dealing with a toxic, localized culture.
And the same thing was happening in Corinth, right?
Yes.
The letters to the Corinthians feature strict rules about women being silent, but the historical data shows that Corinthian worship services had basically devolved into utter chaos.
Total chaos.
You had uneducated citizens who were heavily influenced by ecstatic mystery cults, literally shouting questions across the room during the teachings and disrupting the entire gathering.
Yeah. In both Ephesus and Corinth, the primary threat wasn't actually the gender of the speaker.
Okay.
The primary threat was the destruction of order and sound doctrine.
It's like finding an old company memo that says nobody is allowed to talk in the break room.
Yeah.
If you don't know the context, you might just enforce silence in that break room forever. But if you know there was a specific noise complaint that week, you realize it was a localized fix. It wasn't a forever law.
Right.
So what does this all mean for how strictly these rules are applied today?
Well, that historical awareness is the very thing that prevents modern churches from falling into rigid legalism.
Okay.
Recognizing that Paul was addressing localized chaos allows modern theologians to extract the underlying principle, which is the preservation of order, humility, and sound doctrine, without necessarily demanding the absolute silencing of half the congregation in every conceivable scenario today.
Which makes total sense.
Right. This is why you see that middle ground in our sources, where some conservative churches have women teaching mixed Sunday school classes or offering specific messages, as long as it's under the oversight of elders.
Which brings us to the core tension, and honestly, what I found to be the most psychologically complex part of this entire deep dive.
Oh, for sure.
Because even with the historical context understood, these communities are still actively trying to balance a theology of male leadership with the desperate need to fully release the spiritual gifts of women.
And this is where the theology hits the pavement of everyday human nature. The research outlines the complementarian ideal, which is that God's design involves male responsibility for loving, sacrificial leadership.
Right.
And there is a very specific phrase used in the text to describe what that looks like when executed properly. I say it creates space rather than restriction.
Meaning that a true leader doesn't build a cage, they build a scaffold.
Exactly.
They carry the structural weight of the organization so that everyone else inside that structure has the safety and the freedom to fully exercise their talents. That's the ideal anyway.
That's the ideal. But the texts immediately pivot to the painful reality of human failure. And they specifically point out a phenomenon they call the void.
The void.
Yeah, the void is the fallout of male passivity. The observation is that when men abdicate their responsibility, when they just check out spiritually, emotionally, or practically within the church or the home, a structural vacuum is created.
And what happens then?
Historically, women do not let the community collapse. Out of faithfulness, out of pure necessity, women step up and fill that void. They take on the teaching, the administration, all the heavy lifting.
But I have to call out a potential catch-22 here in the source text.
Let's hear it.
We're seeing women praised for their faithfulness and stepping up. They are acknowledged as the glue holding the community together. Yet, in the same breath, their leadership in these moments is framed as a tragic symptom of male failure.
Yes.
The text calls it the painful cost of passivity. Doesn't that put women in an incredibly tough spot where their exercise of gifts is inherently viewed as a backup plan, like a flashing warning light that the men in the room have failed?
That tension is the exact center of the modern debate. And the sources fully acknowledge the heavy burden that framework places on women. It is a deeply uncomfortable space to inhabit.
Yeah, I would imagine.
But the complementarian argument is that diagnosing a structural imbalance is not the same as devaluing the person standing in the gap.
But how do they resolve that without basically telling women, please be highly gifted, but please wait for a man to drop the ball before you use those gifts?
They resolve it by pointing back to the scaffold analogy. The ideal presented in these sources isn't a zero-sum game where women only get to lead if men fail.
Okay.
The healthiest model, according to this framework, actively avoids the toxic extreme where men must dominate everything, and the egalitarian extreme where gender structure is just irrelevant.
Right.
The goal is a deeply integrated community where robust, sacrificial male leadership provides the order, and that very order intentionally platforms and releases the immense theological and practical gifts of women. They're meant to bear the weight together, distinct but inseparable.
Wow. So what does this all mean when you strip away the centuries of tradition and the theological debates? As we synthesize the physical size of the room, the complexities of an all-female stadium versus a mixed sanctuary, the historical chaos of the Artemis cult, and the psychological weight of the leadership void, what is the ultimate baseline these sources are driving toward?
The ultimate baseline, the final synthesis of all these rules and boundaries, is actually surprisingly simple.
Okay.
Regardless of who is presenting the message, regardless of the room's square footage, the standard for the church remains unyielding. The teaching must be driven by love, it must maintain order, and it must actively edify the listeners.
Sound orderly and edifying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because the underlying premise of all these texts is that the structural mechanics of the church exist for one singular purpose, to clearly point every individual in the room toward the saving grace of Jesus.
Right.
If a theological debate about who holds the microphone obscures the actual message being delivered, then the entire community has lost the plot.
It totally reorients the entire conversation. And for you, listening right now, whether you are sitting in a pew, navigating these specific church dynamics, or you are analyzing power structures in a corporate boardroom, or just trying to understand how ancient texts shape modern communities, understanding the why beneath the boundaries changes how you interact with them.
It really does.
It moves you past the binary frustration of just a simple speed limit or dress code. You start to see the underlying values, like the desperate desire for order, the localized historical context that shape policy, and the delicate balance between institutional authority and relational influence.
Which raises an important question for anyone studying institutions. Like, how much of our current policy is just an inherited tourniquet from a crisis we no longer face, and how much of it is a foundational load-bearing wall we cannot afford to remove?
That is the perfect question. But before we close, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. Something that takes this ancient debate and drops it squarely into our modern reality.
Oh, I love these.
So we've established that the historical sources rely heavily on the difference between the small private household and the large public assembly, right? The private room is the softer landing spot for relational influence.
Correct.
But look at the digital age we live in right now. A woman can sit in a small, completely private room, just her, a desk, and a microphone. She can record a deeply theological teaching. And the moment she hits publish, that podcast can be downloaded and listened to by 3 million men and women across the globe.
Oh, wow.
In a world defined by digital streaming and infinite global reach, where does small and private end and large and public begin?
That's a profound question.
We'll let you chew on that. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you, and we'll catch you next time.
In the pages of the book we see
Priscilla taught one man the way to be small and relational, truth spoken clear. Women using gifts without causing fear. Not every platform, not every stage, but in the proper place where hearts engage. It's the heart of the matter, love, order, grace, edification leading to His face. No matter who is teaching, young or old, pointing souls to Jesus, making whole. Women gather large in rooms of their own, teaching sisters truths that God has shown. But in the blended family assembly, many see the pulpit best for men to lead, not to silence voices rich and true, but to honor patterns Scripture drew. It's the heart of the matter, love, order, grace, edification leading to His face. No matter who is teaching, young or old, pointing souls to Jesus, making whole. Problems, not the gifts, custom fitting where the Spirit lives. Men lead well, women flourish free, every voice in harmony. It's the heart of the matter, love, order, grace, building up the body in this place. Every listener drawn by truth and light to the saving grace of Christ.